Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to unpack a truly fascinating, deeply data-driven autopsy of the Indian economy, specifically looking at exactly where it stood on the very eve of its independence in 1947. You know, we so often hear about the massive political struggles for independence, right? But the actual economic reality that the brand new nation inherited, well, that is a gripping story all on its own. We're going to map out the complete structural transformation of an entire subcontinent over 2 centuries of British rule, using some really incredible historical data and first-hand accounts. So let's dive right into it.
Here is how we're going to break this down. We'll start with before the empire, move into the agricultural stagnation, look at systematic deindustrialization, trade and wealth drain, the demographic reality, and wrap up with a complex legacy.
All right, part 1, before the empire. Back in 1894, the Viceroy of British India pretty bluntly stated that India was the pivot of the British Empire. And honestly, this wasn't just some grand political rhetoric. It was an absolute on-the-ground economic reality. Great Britain's rapidly expanding modern industrial base came to rely heavily on the Indian subcontinent. But you have to ask yourself, what exactly did they take over in the first place?
Well, picture this. 17th century accounts from the French traveler Bernier described a pre-colonial Bengal that he genuinely believed was richer than Egypt. We're talking about a highly prosperous, completely independent economy exporting an immense abundance of cotton, silk, rice, sugar, and butter. In fact, India was world-renowned for its exquisite handicraft industries. Take the Dakai muslin, for example. It was a cotton textile so incredibly fine they called it Mal Mal Shahi, which literally translates to fit for royalty. Yet, fast forward to 1947, and this rich, self-sustaining economy had been fundamentally transformed into a stagnant, highly vulnerable agrarian landscape.
Which brings us to Section 2, the agricultural stagnation.
85%. Let that sink in for a second. At the time of independence, a massive 85% of the country's population lived mostly in villages and derived their livelihood directly or indirectly from agriculture. When an overwhelming majority of your entire population is tied to just one sector, while the health of that sector dictates the health of the entire nation. And unfortunately, under colonial rule, this crucial sector experienced severe stagnation and really unusual deterioration.
So, why the massive stagnation? A huge driver of this was the introduction of new land settlement systems, most notably the Zamindari system, which was implemented largely in the Bengal Presidency. Under this system, the profits from the land didn't actually go to the cultivators working the soil. Instead, they went straight to landlords, or zamindars. Basically, the zamindars merely collected rent, totally regardless of the economic condition of the cultivators. But it gets deeper. The colonial government had set these incredibly strict terms for revenue settlement. Specific dates for depositing fixed sums were set in stone, and if zamindars failed to pay, boom, they lost their rights. This intense, relentless pressure from the top meant cultivators faced immense misery and had absolutely zero resources or even the incentive to invest in improving their own land.
And on the ground, the reality was bleak. Cultivators were working the land with remarkably low levels of technology. The whole sector was completely starved of investment in things like terracing, flood control, and drainage. There was negligible use of fertilizers and a severe lack of irrigation facilities. Now, to be fair, in absolute terms, the agricultural sector did see some growth because the total area under cultivation actually expanded. But this was mostly due to the forced commercialization of agriculture, meaning a shift away from food crops to cash crops that were desperately needed by British industries. So while the area grew, actual agricultural productivity itself remained incredibly dismal.
Moving on to Section 3, Systematic Deindustrialization.
The colonial government pursued a policy of systematic deindustrialization, and they had a very clear twofold economic motive for doing this. Step 1, reduce India to the status of a mere exporter of important raw materials to feed the rapidly growing modern industries over in Britain. Step 2, turn India into a sprawling, captive consumer market for the finished products coming straight out of those exact same British industries. This 1-2 punch absolutely devastated the indigenous handicraft sector, creating massive unemployment and effectively forcing Indians to buy cheap manufactured goods imported from Britain. Now, during the second half of the 19th century, some modern industry did slowly begin to take root, but progress was painfully sluggish. Initially, it was really just cotton mills in Maharashtra and Gujarat, and some foreign-dominated jute mills over in Bengal. Eventually, by 1907, the Tata Iron and Steel Company, or TISCO, was incorporated. And then after the Second World War, a few industries in sugar, cement, and paper started to emerge. But here is the critical catch. There was hardly any domestic capital goods industry. meaning India wasn't producing the machine tools needed to actually build other industries. So this slow trickle of modern manufacturing couldn't even come close to replacing the massive displaced handicraft sector, and its overall contribution to the gross domestic product, it remained very, very small.
Okay, Section 4. Trade and Wealth Drain. When the artificial Suez Canal opened up in 1869, it was an absolute game-changer globally, but definitely not for India's benefit. By completely removing the need to sail all the way around the tip of Africa, it provided a direct trade route that slashed transportation costs drastically. Both strategically and economically, this structurally tightened Britain's monopoly over India's foreign trade. In fact, more than half of India's foreign trade was strictly restricted to Britain alone.
And this brings us to a really fascinating, yet devastating economic illusion. You see, throughout the colonial period, India actually generated a consistently large export surplus. On paper, that sounds fantastic, right? A huge export surplus? But this surplus came at a massive cost. Essential, everyday commodities like food grains and clothes were suddenly incredibly scarce in the domestic market because they were all being shipped out. Furthermore, this massive export surplus did not result in any flow of gold or silver back into India. Nope. Instead, it was entirely used to make payments for a colonial office set up in Britain, to fund various wars fought by the British government, and to pay for invisible item imports. It was a literal drain of Indian wealth.
Which leads us to Section 5, the demographic reality. This data point is where the human cost really hits you. At the time, overall literacy in the country was less than 16%. And if we look closer at female literacy, it sat at a shockingly negligible low of about 7%. The social development indicators across the board were just deeply, deeply discouraging.
And honestly, it gets even heavier. Life expectancy was a mere 32 years. Really think about that for a second. 32 years, which is in stark contrast to the roughly 70 years we expect today. This incredibly low number was fueled by a severe lack of adequate public health facilities, which made water and airborne diseases absolutely rampant, taking a massive toll on human life.
Which leads directly to this next alarming figure. The infant mortality rate was roughly 218 per thousand. To put that into perspective for you, compare it to modern figures, which sit around 28 per thousand today. The overall mortality rate across the nation was exceptionally high.
A massive section of the population lacked even the absolute most basic needs, things like adequate housing. In the complete absence of any robust public health infrastructure, and combined with an economy that was barely chugging along, extensive and debilitating poverty prevailed across the entirety of the population during the colonial period. It was a severe structural worsening of the population's overall profile.
Finally, Section 6, a complex legacy.
The occupational structure showed almost zero sign of change over several decades. Look at this. You have 70 to 75% of the workforce locked into an agriculture sector that, as we've already seen, was completely starved of investment and heavily stagnant. Meanwhile, manufacturing sat at a mere 10%, and services hovered somewhere between 15 and 20%. This represents an incredibly rigid economy that had essentially been purposefully designed to remain agrarian.
Now, I should point out that the legacy wasn't entirely uniform everywhere. There were some interesting, albeit slight, regional variations. Parts of the Madras Presidency, Bombay, and Bengal actually witnessed a slight decline in agricultural dependence, coupled with a commensurate increase in manufacturing and services. But at the exact same time, states like Orissa, Rajasthan, and Punjab saw an actual increase in the share of their workforce tied to agriculture. So it was a very fractured, uneven inheritance.
Which leaves us with this final, truly monumental question. How exactly does a newly independent nation, one inheriting a systematically depleted industrial base, a completely starved agricultural sector, fractured regional economies, and a population suffering from massive, debilitating poverty, how do they set about planning for their future? This was the exact, incredibly daunting reality the new Indian government faced in 1947. To go from this profound state of extraction and stagnation to attempting planned economic development is easily one of the most compelling challenges of the entire 20th century. It's definitely something to think deeply about as you consider how modern economies are actually built from the ground up. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the data.